I want to start with the concept of research. Everybody is talking about research these days, and everybody is supposed to be doing it. But usually, if somebody claims to be doing research, if you meet somebody and they say they're a researcher, you'll probably expect that, well, this person must be a scientist. So when people talk about research, the default assumption is that research is something that scientists do. And we mean by that some kind of rather specialized inquiry devoted to testing hypotheses and advancing theory through conjecture and refutation. And even if a person, a scholar, is not a scientist in themselves, maybe they're a historian or an economist, we still somehow expect them to be able to say what they're trying to find out, what methods they're using, and how the knowledge they think they're going to acquire will advance their own discipline and benefit humanity as a whole. These are the sorts of questions that we usually expect to be answered. If somebody says, I'm a researcher, we do expect them to be able to say what they're researching on, how they're doing it, what they're expecting to find, and how that's going to be of benefit to everybody else. Well, but nowadays, and this is a relatively new thing, it's not only scientists, historians, economists, and archaeologists who are supposed to be doing research. Now artists are supposed to be doing research too. And very often artists find that they have to present what they're doing as research in order to get both the funding they need to carry on with it and also the institutional support and recognition for their work on which their work depends. So how on earth does an artist explain to people that they're doing research? If somebody says, what are you trying to find out? What methods are you using? What knowledge are you going to produce? What use is this knowledge? How on earth is an artist expected to respond to questions like that? And very often they find it rather difficult, if impossible. They say, well, I don't know what I'm trying to find out. We'll see what happens. And I don't know what methods I'm using. I'm just doing things. And I have no idea what knowledge it's going to produce, if anything, or what benefit it might be. But I'm doing my art. And that's what an artist would like to be able to say. So what does the artist do? I mean, are we expecting that artists should somehow learn to behave like scientists in order to present themselves as researchers? And if they are to present themselves as being sort of scientists, then what are they trying to find out? And what kinds of knowledge do artists think they can contribute that science cannot? Now, what I want to argue today, or to start off with anyway, is that rather than expecting artists to be doing science or to behave like scientists in order to qualify as researchers, I think we should turn it the other way around and say, really, it's for scientists to explain what they are doing in the industrial scale collection of data and its conversion into knowledge products. How on earth can they think that that is a practice of research? In other words, we should be challenging the scientists and say, wait a moment, what do you think you're doing when you say that what you're doing is research? Because the view I want to propose is that actually real research is what the artists are doing and have been doing all along. Because real research means entering into the relations and processes that are going on in the world and following their evolution from the inside. So I want to present research as indeed a kind of experimental practice. But these are experiments in which every experiment is not just an action done, but an experience undergone. I mean, in the typical scientific experiment, you set the experiment up, You have your initial conditions, you collect your data, and you come up with the conclusion. So that everything that goes on is contained, bracketed within the frame of the experiment themselves. So that all the undergoing is contained within that one action that is the experiment. But what if we turned that around and said, no, really, an experiment is an experience, something that is undergone, so that both the experimenter and the things or people that are experimented with are transformed as a result of it, so that life actually moves on through the experience that is undergone. So I want to go back to the original meaning of the word research. I mean, what does research originally? Research means to search again. It's a second search. You do your first search and then you do a second one. So that every bit of research, every act of research doubles up on what you've done before, but is in itself an original intervention in its turn. I mean, suppose you go for a walk and you walk along the same path that you walked before. So I walked along that path yesterday, and now today I'm going to walk it again and see, well, maybe it's in some ways the same and in some ways different. And then tomorrow I'll do it again. And then I'll do it again after that. And I'll keep on doing the same walk, not because by reproducing it every time I might discover whether I got the right data, but because every walk is different, and every time you walk, it is both a doubling up on what you did before and an original intervention in its turn. Or just to give you another example, because apart from being an anthropologist, I also play the cello, and so I'm playing the same pieces, often, usually, Bach, pieces of Bach on my cello. I'm playing the same piece over and over and over and over again. But I'm not simply repeating it, because every time I play it, I'm both playing it again, but also playing it for the first time, because every time I play it, it's different. And the music itself is something that evolves for me through all those performances, and every performance moves me on in some sense. I'm not the same after it as I was before. So I want research to mean a second search, which is something that takes you forwards. There's a rather nice term that was proposed by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari in their mammoth book, Mille Plateaux, Thousand Plateaus, where they say it's a question not of iteration, but of itineration. Itinerary is a journey, right? So itineration is carrying on along a journey, in which every time you walk that path, it's a little bit different. Whereas iteration is a strict repetition. So research is a process of itineration, which doesn't then close up on solutions. It never comes to an end, but it is continually opening up new horizons. So it's a process of renewal rather than a process that brings things to an end. So what drives this process, because it just keeps on going, what drives this process of research is what we call curiosity. It's a curiosity to find out, to know, to understand. But it's quite interesting that this word curiosity comes from the same Latin root, curare, which also means to care. So curiosity and care are two sides of the same coin. I mean, the way we care for people and things and the world is by being curious about them, by wanting to find out how they are, by wanting to find out about them. And so research is a process of continually trying to find out how the world is as our way of caring for it. So then the question is, if you're a researcher and you're carrying on along this path without any end to it, when there are always new horizons and continual renewal, what are you searching for? What are you looking for? And I think the answer is truth. And that research never ends, because fundamentally research is a search for truth. Indeed, if we were to abandon truth and say, no, it's not got nothing to do with research, then we might as well give up on the whole thing. I mean, if research is not a search for truth, then what could it possibly be? It must be something like that. But it also rests on an acknowledgement that truth is something we can never conquer, that we can never master, that we can never own. I mean, nowadays you find that people are a little bit terrified of the notion of truth. If you use the word, people say, "Oh, we better put it inside inverted commas." Not really truth. It's as though it's slightly scary. And the reason why truth is a slightly scary word is that so many dictators, tyrants throughout history have claimed to be the masters of truth, claimed to be able to say, I know, I'm a tyrant, I know what the truth is, and I'm going to impose it on all of you. And we know that every time this happens in history, the consequences are absolutely catastrophic. So that history is full of deluded characters who claim to be the masters of truth, and it's full of disasters that have followed in the wake of that claim to mastery. But I don't think we should blame truth for the crimes that have been committed in its name. I mean, it's not truth's fault if Trump-like characters have come along and they say they know everything and impose it on everybody else. Rather, we should adopt an attitude of humility and accept that indeed truth is not something we will ever finally reach, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep searching for it. So that suggests that in the process of research, there's no final release into the light. I mean, we've inherited, I suppose, from the last few centuries, an Enlightenment model of science, in which science progresses closer and closer to the truth, and eventually we will find everything out, and we will be enlightened. So that there's a process in which, according to the Enlightenment model, we start off in the darkness, and through our unremitting efforts of research, we'll finally work our way out into the light. But if research is a never-ending pursuit of truth, we're never going to get into the light. I mean, that actually research continually goes on, as it were, in the shadows. We can't suppose, as many scientists do, that we're on the point of opening the last envelope and then we'll be released into some kind of glorious era of full enlightenment. That doctrine is the doctrine of optimism. So the doctrine of progress, of progressive enlightenment, is still very dominant in our liberal society. It suggests that if we work hard enough, we'll make lots of progress. We can be optimistic that we're very close to getting there. Just a few more steps, and we'll reach the light. Now, I don't think that that sense of optimism and progress is one that is compatible with any idea of sustainability, with the idea of being able to carry life on. But I think there is room, if not for optimism, there is room for hope. And there's a very important distinction between optimism and hope. I mean, optimism is that we're almost there. We'll finally arrive at the golden future. Hope is rather the sense that we can carry on, that every generation can be a new generation, that it can carry things on, that in a sense, what research does is to convert every closure into an opening, every conclusion into a new beginning, so that the generations that follow us can carry on the life that we've laid for them. So in that sense, research is a sort of guarantor that life can carry on. It's a guarantor that of the sustainability of life. And in that sense, and this is very important, research is about renewal rather than novelty. In most mainstream accounts of what we're supposed to be doing in research, there's an incredible emphasis on innovation. After all, in industry, research and innovation are usually go together, and people assume that if you're doing research, you must be coming up with innovations, with things, with new solutions to problems. Because if nothing is new, then what on earth is the point of what you're doing? This argument is continually brought forward that you have to point to the potential novelty of your findings in order to justify research. But the thing about novelty is that it's always about ends rather than beginnings. That you find a novel solution to a problem, that you find a novel product or a novel artifact that will carry out a particular task. So novelty produces a plethora of ends. But what is really important in research is the production of beginnings. The ability to turn what look like conclusions to our study into things from which it's possible then to begin again, to start afresh, so that there's the constant possibility of renewal. So there is this really, really important distinction between novelty or innovation on the one hand and renewal or rebirth on the other. And we need to shift our understanding of what research is from a quest for innovation or novelty to a quest for renewal, renewal of life. Now, one of the implications of this view is that research has to go, as it were, beyond the facts. That when we find things out, those things, the factuality of those things is not the end of our inquiry, because there's a point when facts turn round and start telling us how to observe the world. And what I mean by that is that the truth of the world is something that can only be disclosed from within. It's not something that we can observe from outside, like an objective fact. It has to be something that we experience from the interiority of our life. Just to give you an example, a very simple example. Suppose that somebody has committed a crime. Maybe they've committed a murder, right? And they are arrested and they're taken to court, and there's a trial. And at the trial, the facts of what happened are set out before the court. And there is absolutely no doubt, and maybe the murderer himself admits to it, that these things happened, that there certain events happened which resulted in a particular person being murdered. So that's established. The facts of the case are established. And you might think, okay, that it's true, the murder was committed by this person. But then there's something that we call guilt. And the murderer, who is proved guilty by the facts, also has to live with a moral, a conscious experience that we call guilt. And that's a completely different matter, because guilt is a state of mind, a state of consciousness, it's a state of body as well. It's a feeling that maybe endures for as long as that person's life goes on, and they have to find ways of coming to terms with it. So the truth of guilt means something quite different if we simply confine ourselves to the facts of the case. This is what happens. And guilt as, we might say, a moral and spiritual condition. And the truth of guilt in that sense is something completely different. And if we're going to get to that, if research is going to get to that kind of truth, then it has to go beyond the facts. And the important thing is research obviously depends on observation. We can't do research without observing the world. But there's a point at which observation goes beyond objectivity. We might observe simply to get the facts of the case, but then there's a point at which observation goes beyond that. Like when you observe say you're learning a trade, and you're observing the master who's teaching you, observing the master carrying out a particular operation. You're watching it very closely so that you can imitate and learn and carry it out for yourself. That's not an observation of the facts. It's an observation that actually joins with a process that is carrying on. You're watching somebody doing something in order to learn how to do it yourself. You're watching the process as it unfolds and linking your own attention to that process that you're observing. So there's a point at which observation goes beyond objectivity, where observation goes beyond the facts, and where what were the facts begin to tell you how to observe. I mean, anthropologists know this very well, because we do, in our fieldwork, we do what is called participant observation, and that means that we are indeed observing what is going on, but we observe through, so far as we can, participating in the action itself, so that we get a feeling from the inside. Now, once we've participated enough and we feel, yes, I begin to understand this now because I've been doing it as well, and I have the feel of it in my own body, in my bones. I know what it feels like. That's the point. So in participant observation, the people that the anthropologist is working with are not just, objects of their observation. Those people are telling the anthropologist how to observe. They're saying, look, watch what I'm doing. Pay attention to this, pay attention to that. So the attentiveness is there in the observation. So it's when the things we study begin to tell us how to observe that the quest for truth goes beyond the facts. And this isn't just a matter of, it doesn't just apply when working with other people. It can be in working with plants or animals or rocks or anything. Every practicing scientist will tell you, particularly if they're field scientists, people who like field geologists or field botanists, they'll tell you that what they really have to get to know the animal or the plant or the rock really intimately, in such a way that they're observing it with eyes and with hands that have themselves been trained by the very thing that they're studying. That in that sense, they really get to know it from the inside. So if, like my dad was a mycologist, he studied fungi, and he would understand, he would look at fungi, as it were, with a fungal eye, because of all that training and experience. There'd be something mycelial about the way you look at the mycelium. The world turns around and looks at itself through the scientist. And that's what I mean in suggesting that we should perhaps think of research as what I call a practice of correspondence. And by correspondence, I don't mean one thing matching up to another thing. I mean lines of attention going along together and answering to one another as they go. And the best example is simply playing music together or singing in a choir, where there are a number of different melodic lines in counterpoint, and each line as it goes along is continually responding to the other one. So you have different lines carrying on together and all the time responding to one another. So research in that sense is the process of correspondence, meaning that it goes along with, carries on with the very phenomena that it's studying and answers to those phenomena as it goes along. So this is what I mean by studying with rather than making a study of. We don't objectify the thing we study, we rather treat that thing as a fellow passenger, as a fellow journeyer in the world that we're going through. We could say that I suppose that this is actually a way of loving. It's a form of love, a way of loving what it is you're studying. And if you want to be a real researcher, you do actually have to be in love with what you study. And in that sense, to enjoy a sense of responsibility, not just responsibility, but an ability. If you love somebody, then you have the ability to respond to them as they do to you. And so you need to be able to respond to the things you're studying, listen and respond to what those things are trying, or people are trying to tell you. And you have to, in a sense, give back to the world what you owe for your own existence within it. I mean, we exist as human beings, as sensuous, sensible, sensitive creatures, only because we've been born into a world that provides us with a place to live, the wherewithal, the relationships, and so on. So our existence is forged within a world. We couldn't exist without it. And so in a sense, we owe something back to that world. We're indebted to it for our own existence, and we owe something in return. And in a way, this research through correspondence is giving back what we owe. And it lies not just in what we do, but in what we undergo. And this is very important, that the research is not just about doing, it's also about undergoing. It's not just about action, it's also about suffering. And these two things have to go together. I mean, if any of you are familiar with the writings of John Dewey, it's a wonderful work of John Dewey on art and experience, where he actually talks about art in precisely these terms, in terms of how one can understand in artistic work the precise relationship between doing and undergoing. And his point is that when you do a work, you also always undergo, and that undergoing always overflows the doing and enters into whatever you do next. And that must be the case with research and experimentation as well. So in experience and in experiments, the things we study with are with us. And I think that is where science can align with art. And this is what art does anyway, but we ought to be doing science in that way too. We need to train scientists to be correspondents. And actually in practice, most of them are, and they will admit to it. It's just that their institutions and the way scientific work is reported and published and funded does not allow for it. So they have to suppress. Scientists have to keep quiet about the extent to which they're really in love with the things they study and the sorts of correspondences they have with them, because that's supposed to be subjective and soft, and you're not supposed to talk about that kind of thing. But we would do much, much better science if we rooted it in that art of correspondence. And by doing so, we would call into question those established divisions between fact and fantasy, or between truth and illusion, because it's those divisions, this idea that we can somehow separate out the imaginary from the real, that has both reduced or impoverished the real and turned imagination into nothing more than mental representation. What we have to do is to try and get beyond those dichotomies between fact and fantasy, truth and illusion. So if truth lies beyond the facts, then science can become research only insofar as it is willing to forego objectivity and to follow the way of art into a correspondence that unites experience and imagination in attending to a world that also attends to us. So what I'm saying in short is, rather than when we talk about research, rather than expecting that artists somehow have to start behaving like scientists, we really need to reform science and say, no, it's high time the scientists started behaving a bit more like artists and stop thinking about art as just some sort of elaborate public relations exercise for helping to disseminate scientific findings, which is the way it tends to be seen at the moment. So with that, I come back to what I think to be my definition of truth. For me, truth is not fact rather than fantasy, but truth lies in the unison of experience and imagination in a world to which we are alive, and that is alive to us. In fact, Maya already referred to this in her kind introductory remarks, but I'll repeat it again for you now. So, in the process of, I want to move now from talking about research specifically to talking about education in general. Because I want to argue that in the process we call education, teachers and students work together as companions and fellow travelers in this search for truth. So that education and research are really the same thing. And education is a form of research, right? So research is a form of education. Education is as much devoted to the search for truth as research is, but with education, it involves people who call themselves teachers and people who call themselves students collaborating, working together in this research process. Now, this word education is an interesting one etymologically because it has two possible etymological derivations. Most commonly, it's assumed that the word education comes from the Latin educare, which simply means the passing on of an authoritative, authorized body of knowledge from the senior generation to the junior generation. So it's a very normative, very orthodox, conventional idea of education as instilling in the younger generation the knowledge of their seniors on the grounds that this is knowledge you need to know in order to maintain society in an ordered way. So educare, education as educare, is basically about transmission. It's about passing down a body of knowledge from senior generation to the junior generation in a way that the knowledge itself is not affected by the transfer. It's the same knowledge. Ideally, the junior generation should end up with the same knowledge in their heads that the senior generation started with. But there's another derivation, etymological derivation, which says that the word education comes from the Latin ex ducere. Now, ex means out, and ducere means to lead. So education as ex ducere is a way of leading students out into the world. It's a process not of instilling knowledge into their heads, it's a process of exposure by taking them out into a world which might seem strange and even dangerous. Now, what I want to propose is that we, and I'm not the only one to do this, but I want to propose that we shift our understanding of what education is from the sense of educare to the sense of ex ducere. So we want to see both research and education as a process of leading out. And fundamentally, that process is not about transmission, not about the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next, but about attention. So the key to educare is transmission, the key to ex ducere is attention. Attention, of course, comes also from Latin ad tendere, which means to stretch out or stretch towards something. But again, attention can mean two different things. It's another derivation from attention. It comes in French, it's attendre, which in English means to wait. So attending means, like when we talk about attending, it means you're waiting upon them. A waiter in a restaurant is one who attends the needs of others, brings their food and everything. He's a waiter because he waits upon the requirements of the diners. So it's in some sense a position of submission. You're attending to the world is submitting to it, waiting for it, and then responding to its demands. So that's one sense of attention. Attention that involves a degree of submission, a degree of patience, a degree of waiting for the world to do what it does, so that you can then respond to it. But another sense of attention is quite different. It suggests rather that it's the world that is waiting for you. It's a sense that I took from the writings of the founder of ecological psychology, James Gibson, in his theory of perception. Gibson speaks there about the education of attention. And he means by that the way in which our perceptual skills are attuned to particular properties of the world that are important for what we do simply through practice and training in an environment. So, for example, a musician learns to attend to very fine differences of pitch so that they can play in tune. I mean, if you can't notice the difference of pitch, it's very hard to play in tune. So you have to learn, you have to train your ear so that you can detect very, very tiny variations in pitch that a non-musician might not even notice. A cook or a chef has to train their attention of smell and taste in order to produce those subtle variations in the food. For the practitioner of any kind of skill, any kind of craftsperson, usually has to train their perception to pick up very subtle variations in the environment, in the materials they're working with, so that they can respond to those as they come up. So and this kind of attention is not about submission, it's about mastery. It's about skillment, about skilled mastery. And both these kinds of attention, the attention where you're waiting for the world and the attention when the world is waiting for you, always in any kind of action go together. Let me give you another simple example. When you walk on 2 feet and you put one foot into the other, in front of the other when you take a step, you'll try it and you'll see it. Every time you put your foot out, in fact, you're risking falling over. And you basically, for a moment, are in a state of complete imbalance, and you will topple forward were it not for the fact that you put your next foot out, plant it on the ground, and your stability is resumed. So with every step, what happens is first a submission in which you place yourself at risk, expose yourself to the world, and then that's followed immediately by the skilled mastery that you have because you know how to walk, of where to put your foot in order to re-establish an equilibrium. So that when we walk along, there's this alternation of submission, mastery, and every kind of skilled activity in the world involves those two components. You have to push your boat out into the unknown, not knowing what will happen. Otherwise, you'd be just stuck. You wouldn't get anywhere. You have to push your boat out into the unknown, and then you depend on those bodily skills that you've developed through practice in order to keep some sort of equilibrium so that you can then push out again, so that you can establish equilibrium, and so the process goes on. So in that process, it's not that we are first masters and then submission follows. Mastery is something that follows on from submission. And in one case, our attention is educated by exposing ourselves to a world in formation, and in the other, it's attention itself that is educated through by virtue of this experience. So there's this coupling, if you like, in exducere, in this kind of education that takes place by leading out. There's a coupling of exposure and enskillment. Exposure it comes from, again, expositio, means being taken out of position. Exposure means placing yourself at risk, going outside your ordinary comfort zone, going out. And enskillment then means using those skills of perception and action to keep your course, hold your equilibrium, to keep on going rather than just collapsing. So these two things go together. The two sides of the education of attention are exposure and enskillment. Now, I mean, the next stage in my argument is to show how that notion of education through exposure and enskillment takes us way beyond any conventional understanding of teaching and learning. I mean, again, in the university, for example, we're continually being told that there are teaching and learning committees and teaching and learning assessments, and everything that we're supposed to do is teaching and learning. Understood very often simply as a one-way transmission of knowledge. So the aim of teaching and learning, T and L, is to convey the knowledge that needs to be conveyed as quickly, efficiently, and painlessly as possible from teachers to students. And nowadays, students are paying money to get this knowledge. I think that's what's supposed to happen. They're supposed to buy this knowledge, and people are supposed to give it to them. And nowadays, in universities that think they're better than all the others, they say that teaching is research-led. What do they mean by saying that teaching is research-led? They mean that the people who are doing the teachers are active researchers themselves, producing all these novelties, all these innovations, and so the students being taught by these people will receive this cutting-edge knowledge at first hand rather than second hand. They'll actually receive it from the people who've created it, and that's all very exciting. But if education, like research as I presented it, is really dedicated to the pursuit of truth, then it's research-led not because it conveys the results of research at first rather than second hand, but because it leads out, exducere, leads out along paths of inquiry that research in its redoubling ceaselessly opens up. So in other words, education must go beyond the transmission of newly minted knowledge products, as in teaching and learning, if it is to follow in the footsteps of research. We have to think of education, if you like, if teaching and learning is like a vertical thing, education is going along horizontally. It's quite different. Or an image I like is imagine a flowing river. And there are people on one side of the river who have some knowledge and people on the other side who don't, and they're trying to throw knowledge across from one side of the river to the other. But real education is actually flowing with the waters of the river. It's not crossing from one side to the other at all, but going along in a completely different direction. So I want to suggest an understanding of education as a practice of exposure. The educational philosopher whose work, Jan Maschlein, whose work I greatly admire, has called this poor pedagogy. And he calls it poor pedagogy because he means that actually nothing much is transmitted. I mean, a rich pedagogy would be one in which there's all this knowledge, rich body of knowledge, which is transmitted from the teachers to the students. In poor pedagogy, nothing much is transmitted at all. There's nothing there. And that such pedagogy is, in a sense, a process of disarmament. I mean, nowadays we often talk about arming ourselves with knowledge. We imagine that knowledge is a kind of defensive armor that we put around ourselves so that we can cope with adversity and the things that the world will throw at us. So we surround ourselves with this knowledge, as we might build a castle and live inside the castle. To grow in knowledge is to build the walls of the castle so that we can live inside the castle and be defended against all the dangerous things that are happening outside. So the rhetoric of normal education is that we arm ourselves with knowledge, that it gives us power, that it enables us to defend ourselves against the onslaughts from outside. But poor pedagogy is a process of disarmament. It takes all these defenses away. We go out into the world, expose ourselves to what's going on in the world, completely defenseless. And of course, that's a bit uncomfortable. It's a bit risky. It can be difficult, but by taking our defenses down, we really notice what is going on there. We see, because we're fairly defenseless, we actually attend very, very closely to everything that is going on. We attend to it and learn from it. So exposure doesn't fill us up with knowledge, but it does lead to wisdom. And knowledge and wisdom are quite different here. I mean, knowledge is something that we pile up and accumulate. Wisdom takes all that away and opens us up to what is actually going on in the world. So attending closely to things gives us wisdom rather than knowledge. Now, I'm not suggesting that we can do without knowledge, but I am suggesting that in mainstream education, the balance between knowledge and wisdom has tipped disastrously towards knowledge. And we need to, it is a question of getting the right balance between the two, and we need to tip it back in the direction of wisdom. And that is indeed where I'm wanting to suggest, that is indeed where art, above all, where art comes in. So in this educational process, there are teachers and students, but the process itself is one of research in which teachers and students are going along together. And what happens is that the students themselves are engaged in a process of research, but they're doing it under the watchful eyes of teachers who are already experienced in the process, such that eventually, as the students become more experienced themselves, they will become those eyes. They will become the teachers of the next generation, under which the following generation will then become researchers in their turn. So what I want to stress there, the importance of generational overlap. I mean, we tend to think of generations as layered on top of one another, so that each generation is stacked on top of the one before, and knowledge then has to be transmitted or inherited from the previous generation to the next one, to the next one, and so on, so that each generation replaces the previous one. But I think we should be thinking of generations rather like the fibers of a rope, and these fibers are always overlapping one another and twisting around one another, so that the older generation and the younger generation, they're living their lives together, and they're collaborating in forging a future. So although education, you might say, is the process by which a society secures its own future, that future is not something that is already made by one generation and handed down to the next. It's a future that generations as they overlap and go along together, are also forging together. Well then, the question, we come to the question that I can't answer. How are we to establish, if you agree that this is a good model for research, for education, for bringing art and science together, if you agree with all that, then the question is, how on earth do we institute it, given that our existing institutions are variously subject to forms of what are called in Britain new professional management, corporate and managerial structures that work completely against everything that I've already suggested. I've been thinking recently about the difference between being an amateur and being a professional, because I think that the sort of practice that I've been suggesting of research and education is fundamentally an amateur practice. An amateur practice in the best possible sense. The amateur is one who does something for the love of it, and not as a means to stage a career, but as a way of living their life. Amateurs are people who are indeed in love with what they study, and they study it not to advance their careers, not to get better salaries or get better jobs, but they do it because that's the way they want to live. Now, I think there was a time, until not too long ago, when amateurism and professionalism were not really opposed. You could be a professional with somebody who had a vocation, who was called to work in a particular field for the common good, and did indeed undertake that vocation because they felt a calling for it. But the meaning of professionalism has changed very fundamentally, I think, over the last 30 years, basically in the same period as the world has been taken over by neoliberalism, and it's now it now means something very different. It's to do with corporatism, with managerialism, with careerism, and all those things. So we've come into a situation where it's very difficult to be a professional and an amateur at the same time. And most of us working in universities, probably people outside universities as well, experience this tension very deeply. So the problem is how we can bring the amateur and the professional, or amateurism and professionalism, back together again. Do we need to build new institutions to do that, or can the institutions we have be repurposed? And there's an active debate about this. So there are some people who argue, for example, that our universities are now so hopelessly compromised by corporate and managerial interests that there's nothing more that can be done with them, and that they're manifestly unsustainable, as indeed the global knowledge economy is unsustainable, and they'll collapse. And so the only thing to do is to establish alternative institutions, alternative universities, colleges, where this other model of education and research can be put into practice. And such institutions are popping up all over the world. They're experimental, they're very lively. They also have virtually no funding, no governmental support, and are therefore quite unsustainable in some ways. It's very hard for them, and it's difficult to know how many of these will survive. But that's one alternative. The other is to suggest that universities have been around for many centuries. They're much older than than capitalism even, and they have many times transformed themselves from within in history, and there's no intrinsic reason why they should not be able to transform themselves again, given sufficient will and clarity of purpose. So my own feeling at the moment is that rather than writing off the universities or colleges, it would make more strategic sense to work towards their transformation from within. And I do think that with sufficient will, that can be done. But the problems are formidable, and they don't lie just within the institutions themselves, but they lie with the public as well. So if you take universities, for example, most people in Britain anyway, if you ask most people in Britain, they would quite like their children to go to university if they can get the grades. And they want their children to go to university because they think the university is a place where if they do their studies and get their degree, they'll then be able to get a good job and be able to earn a higher salary and move up the social scale. And many people who were not privileged themselves in their lives have ambitions for their own children, that if only our children can get to university, they can get degrees and they can get good jobs, and we can be really proud of them because they'll be higher up the social ladder. So that view, which is entirely understandable, reinforces and reproduces the idea that the purpose of a university is to provide students with professional qualifications. It is not to open students' eyes, to expose students in a risky way to what is going on in the world. And of course, it reproduces that very meritocratic structure. And where there's a meritocracy, there are people at the top, but there are also people at the bottom. Meritocracy reproduces inequality. It doesn't overcome it because not everybody can rise to the top. And one of the results of meritocracy is to have disastrously, I think, pulled apart education from democracy. You know, I mentioned Dewey a while ago, and a century ago, Dewey argued very persuasively that you can't have democracy without education, and you can't have education without democracy. That these two are absolutely essential to go together. You can't have democratic freedoms without an educated population. But he understood by democracy not some sort of majority rule, but an ongoing conversation of life in which people can, so to speak, get along together in difference. That's what democracy means, and it's also what education means. It's a process of bringing together people from different backgrounds, talking to one another, and not all becoming the same, but learning how to live together in difference. And that is really what we have to do. Because at the moment, we have, because of the way the meritocratic structures have reproduced an unrepresentative elite and left everybody else behind, we have this tension between the education which belongs to the elite and democratic populism, which belongs to all the people who've been left behind. And we all know where that tension leads. So it's an urgent project for our societies to bring democracy and education back together again, so that the public does not equate education with the pretensions of a meritocratic elite. And that means then that the university of the future has to be one that that is aligned with life. It has to be a way of helping people to find in study a way of life rather than a means to enhance a career. So it means that a university has to be an institution that is open for any length of time and at any time of life to anybody who is hungry for scholarship. But that any sense of advantage or disadvantage, of social status, of wealth, all of this should have no place whatever within a university system. The university has to be a place of freedom, if you like, wherein all these structural forces of society are set aside. We have to start talking about education in a way that does not always advantaged and disadvantaged students. As soon as you bring in this question of advantage, you're reproducing the idea of society as a competitive arena in which some will do better than others. And that is really the poison that has to be eradicated from our understanding of what education is.